bed of a private room in the healing halls, Master Che sweeping various scanners over him, when Anakin burst in. "Are you all right?" Anakin demanded before he was even fully inside the room. But Obi-Wan just summoned up a tired smile, well used to the antics of his former apprentice. "I'm fine, Anakin. We'll see about that," Master Che said, and promptly poked him with a needle. "What does that mean?" Anakin asked, alarmed. "Just that they have some more tests to run," Obi-Wan soothed, even as Master Che drew up the syringe's plunger and sucked out his blood force, but he disliked the healer's hull. "Isn't that right, Master Che?" Vakara Che, to Obi-Wan's relief, did grunt and nod, before withdrawing the damn needle and leaving the room. Her parting instructions to stay there, or else, Obi-Wan could fully admit he deserved. When he turned back, Anakin was awkwardly hovering, leaning in toward Obi-Wan like he wasn't sure whether he was allowed to approach. "I'm fine, Anakin." Obi-Wan smiled again, this time more gently. "I was merely caught off guard." He patted the exam bed next to him in invitation. And Anakin did sit down, although he was quite uncharacteristically hesitant. "Master T told me you blacked out from the attack. Only briefly. It's honestly nothing to worry about. I promise that I'm not secretly maimed, and if I was just made the victim of some arcane Sith ritual, I think I would have noticed." Anakin's groan intensified. "You can't just assume that. These are Sith. Time-traveling Sith. Who knows what tricks they have. Sure, they say they don't know how they got here, but they admitted that they were at a Sith temple right beforehand." Anakin took a long, deep breath. So he had remembered at least some of his meditation and self-soothing techniques. "Master, are you just trying to reassure me, or are you honestly not worried?" "A bit of both, if I am to be honest," Obi-Wan replied. "Yes, it is alarming that the Force gave no warning of the attack. But I could feel what Luke was doing up until I passed out. He overwhelmed my shields, yes, and I'm embarrassed to say that I might have lost control under the onslaught. Enough that they became the slightest bit porous. But at no point did he enter my mind. Period. Master, you just said he overwhelmed your shields. And I was very worried," Obi-Wan said, "until they finished the psychic examination. But the healers have certified that there's nothing in my mind that isn't me." Whatever Luke's goal was, Master T must have stopped him in time. Although, actually, he was oddly calm about the situation, even given his long practice at Jedi Seer. But at Luke's name, Anakin had tensed. And Obi-Wan's previous thought was swept away and forgotten completely. "I'm so sorry, Anakin," he breathed. "This must have been especially hard for you to hear about." Anakin just glared at the floor. "Don't be stupid. You're the one that got attacked." "Yes, but for all the Jedi Code has to say about attachment, he's still your son." "Exactly." Anakin burst out. "It was my son that attacked you. You should hate me for this, for breaking the code, and for." He choked himself off and kept staring at the floor. Oh, Anakin. Of course I don't hate you. You had nothing to do with Luke's actions. We are responsible for our own decisions, not for those of the people around us. Luke being your son changes none of that. We are more than our families and our blood." At that, Anakin tensed, and Obi-Wan feared he'd misstepped. But all Anakin said was, "Of course, Master. You're right." The two of them sat in silence until Master Che came return to announce Obi-Wan's release. Perhaps shockingly, the first person Anakin Skywalker came to interrogate wasn't Luke. It was Mara. "What did you tell him to do?" Skywalker ground out as soon as he shoved her into the chair. "Nothing," Mara replied, ready to react to the slightest hint of an attack. "Don't lie to me," Skywalker sneered, leaning over the table and into her face. "All your claims that I can rehabilitate him, but I approach him, start to reach him, and 2 days later he attacks a member of the council. So what was it? Attempted escape, revenge, or you trying to get your apprentice back? Can't it be all three?" Mara bit down on the urge to say, because provoking Skywalker in this state could be fatal. Luke had told her that Obi-Wan had passed out when Ben had entered him, and had still been unconscious when sent to medical. Mara could sympathize with Anakin's fear of losing his master. She imagined the fear of losing his master to his own son made the situation even more painful. Whatever had happened between Anakin and his master in the end, Anakin was lucky Obi-Wan had never died during the Clone Wars. Even from what little she had seen of them together, although with all of the interrogations, she had seen plenty of them separately, she could tell. It had taken her years and years to admit that she was lucky that the Emperor had. "It wasn't my idea," she said instead. "You know that. You would have heard if I'd told him to do anything." Anakin scoffed. "Please, we know he broke his Force binders before the interrogation. I'm not stupid." He picked it out of your mind. Anakin wouldn't believe her sincerity, even if the binders didn't block him from feeling it. It was Luke's plan. Luke says he's loyal to you alone. Unfortunately, he had done so quite emphatically. Luke didn't tell me about it. He was trying to surprise me. To please me. You've poisoned Luke against the Jedi, against me. Mara couldn't let him dwell on that thought any further. What do you want in exchange for my life? Skywalker blinked. Then Luke. Luke wasn't a thing that could be given. Mara didn't lash out. Skywalker was only conducting the conversation on the terms she'd set. I can't make him renounce the dark side. But I will not obstruct your overtures, and there will be no repeats of today's episode. Or at least, there had damn well better not be. Skywalker's mouth tightened. Not good enough. Information, she tried. Actual information, not more bullshit evasions. Information on Luke's life. All the things he won't tell you. And you know so much about Luke's life? Skywalker sneered. Well, yes. But she could hardly admit why. He's a public figure in my time, she shrugged. And as an Imperial agent, I had access to the files on his life. No need to mention the supposed torture, nor the actual assassination attempt. Skywalker's eyes narrowed. Fine. What do you have that's worth me giving you the benefit of the doubt on this, after everything? Mara was tempted to offer information on the fall of the Republic or the Jedi, to try and give them some kind of warning. But while the increased scrutiny that would bring might be good for keeping her alive, it would not be good for her cover. And besides, that wasn't, in that moment, what Skywalker wanted. What in Luke's life would be both valuable enough and safe to give? The information that he was a twin was valuable, certainly. But she wouldn't risk giving that to the man who might still become Darth Vader. Is there anything you want to know? She asked. If not, she'd manage to come up with something. Anything Luke has refused to tell you. Actually, yeah. Skywalker's blue eyes gleamed in the interrogation room's harsh light. When did I die? That's not about Luke. Had Luke said something? Tipped him off? Told him outright, despite the plan? Sure it is. He told me he grew up on Tatooine. Now, since I would have let him grow up there over my dead body, I want to know how young he was when I died. Fuck. The full truth was an unacceptable risk. But the wrong lie could be more so. What might Anakin Skywalker be willing to do if he was convinced he wouldn't have to live with the consequences? But she couldn't give him nothing, either. Records from the end of the Republic are purposefully incomplete, she began, trying to read his reaction. So far, skepticism. Darth Vader's identity was not common knowledge in the New Republic. Not because Luke was ashamed of his parentage. But because his sister's position as chief of state and her emotions regarding Vader had forced Luke to choose between acknowledging his sister and acknowledging his father. He'd chosen Leia. The fact that the galaxy finding out their hero was the son of Vader would have been terrible for morale had not had much bearing on Luke's decision, Mara knew. Because he could be boneheaded like that sometimes. Anakin Skywalker's time and place of death was not formally recorded, she continued truthfully, but it was popularly believed he died at the beginning of the Jedi Purges. She could repeat what Ben had told Luke, all those years ago, but no sense in giving Vader an additional persecution complex. Or more reason to mistrust the Jedi. Luke was born not long after the start of the Purges himself. Anakin's face was bleak as he stared down at the table. So I never lived to meet him. Mara inhaled slowly. She had. It was later discovered that Anakin Skywalker had in fact survived, though not without complications. As a result of those complications, you first met Luke when he was 22 years old. Anakin's eyes shot up to hers. What? He grew up on Tatooine with his aunt and uncle, and that's all I'm telling you. His uncle wait, who? Owen. Yes, and that is all I'm telling you. Anakin was still sputtering. Owen. I trust my information is sufficient. What? Oh yeah, but Owen. That didn't look like it was going anywhere anytime soon. Can you escort me back to my cell now? Skywalker did, and to his credit, he even managed to stop muttering Owen at various levels of confusion before they got to the cell block. Although Mara suspected there would be more to come, Anakin, that's Padme's voice trembled. I know, Anakin said, voice muffled from where his face was buried into his wife's shoulder. I know. Do you think Padme's voice choked off for maybe the first time Anakin had ever heard? Do you think the future can be changed? That we can make sure our son grows up with us? What never of them would acknowledge out loud Padme would never have let their son be raised on Tatooine either, not after all that the planet had done to Anakin. And Luke hadn't said a word about his mother one way or another. Clearly, in whatever future they were from, she had died too. The knowledge was almost more than Anakin could bear. It better be possible. He swallowed. If the Jedi had had a bunch of Sith come back in time and explain our destruction, it wouldn't have happened. So it must be possible. Padme clenched him tighter, but said nothing. Even if they could change their future and save themselves, save their son's future, it wouldn't save the version of their son already in front of them. It was minutes before the silence was broken again, Padme's voice low and hoarse. The Sith said he was redeemable. Do you think she was lying? Anakin's hands fisted in the smooth fabric of his Padme's nightdress as he hugged her tighter, feeling the press of her loose hair against his face. I don't know, Anakin said, despite his throat trying to close at the mere decision to admit it. But I'm not giving up on him. Padme only squeezed him tighter. Then, after several long minutes, she took a deep, bracing breath and straightened the tiniest bit. Anakin's gut clenched at the thought of letting go, of being alone with all of this, but Padme only loosened her embrace a millimeter, and stopped there. If he's willing to attack Obi-Wan, Padme said slowly, he's fallen much further than Vection had led you to believe. Particularly given the character traits and loyalties one would assume of the Master of the Jedi Order. Anakin could feel Padme twitching against him as she said that. The revelation had been even weirder for her than it had for him, Anakin knew, and he found it pretty damn unfathomable. He couldn't sit in front of the council for 5 minutes without wanting to scream. Some days, and his kid his son would be the new Windu and Yoda combined, what with everyone else dead. Master of the Jedi Order. Honestly, it was the sort of thing that sounded like Anakin's personal hell. But his son had been married, had loved and been loved, so he had to believe that maybe, somehow, in its destruction, the order had changed. That the title was an honor for Luke, not the condemnation that Anakin knew Obi-Wan thought his position was half the time, and that as a mere counselor. Sometimes Anakin swallowed. Sometimes we'll be talking. Like what I told you about before. And I could swear it's him I'm talking to, the old Luke, the one that hadn't fallen. He sounds normal and sane and happy just to talk to me. Isn't that a good thing? Padme asked after a moment of silence before slowly leading them to curl up on her plush, elegant couch without ever breaking their embrace. You could be reaching him. Anakin couldn't look at her, for what he had to say. He stared at the woven purple upholstery instead. I told you that the Jedi take a different view of Darksiders than the one Vection is suggesting. The Jedi teach that a fall is permanent. That there's no way back. As far as I've been taught, Luke is dead, and this is the thing that killed him. Padme scoffed, but Anakin could hear the fear underneath it. The Jedi also don't believe in love. Don't make light of this, Padme. I'm not. But the Jedi are not perfect. They are not even the only Force users in the galaxy, and from what you've said, they would be hard-pressed to explain how anyone but the Sith uses the Force. The Jedi are a culture in addition to everything else, and with that comes its own viewpoint. The cycle of building energy Padme had been riding abruptly faded. And besides, she said more quietly, before Anakin could even figure out how to respond, if we believe they're right, if we don't even give this a chance, then we are just giving up on our son. If more of the Jedi Council thought like that, maybe Anakin wouldn't resent them so much. If more senators could argue like that, maybe something would actually get done somewhere in the galaxy. You're right, he whispered into Padme's shoulder. You're right. I know, Padme answered, her voice the slightest hint of gentle teasing. She was right. Anakin couldn't give up. Not on Luke. When the door to their prison opened, it was so far into the night that it counted as morning, and Luke was still awake. He didn't know what time it was, he never did, since they weren't given a clock, and so he was forced to judge the hour by the intervals of meals, interrogations, and his own weariness. Valen, the Inquisitor, and Mara were asleep, because the two of them had been taking shifts that night. But all three bolted awake at the clicking of the door's heavy latch. Obi-Wan Kenobi stood there, framed by the light from the closing door, gaze sweeping over them intently. Well, this is new, Mara said, sounding wry and somehow completely awake. Surely the wise and hallowed Jedi Council doesn't think a little disrupted sleep will be enough to break us. Perhaps not, Obi-Wan said, voice uncaring, but I'm afraid you're all being taken for interrogation now anyway. If everything had gone according to plan. You, Obi-Wan said, pointing at Valen, you're coming with me first. Obi-Wan's manner was as businesslike as always as he escorted Valen, then the Inquisitor, out of their cells and down the hall. When he returned for a second time, the door opened to reveal a face that was considerably warmer. I am glad to report that your attack on my counterpart was not in vain. Luke broke out into a grin as old Ben Kenobi strode over to unlock Luke's cell, then his cuffs. Mara's expression, Luke could see out of the corner of his eye, was complicated. Luke felt much the same. He had attacked Obi-Wan, his old mentor, a member of the Jedi Council, but as he swept Ben into an embrace that the man clearly did not expect at all, he let those conflicted thoughts melt away. Ben was here. Their plan had worked. That would have to be a start. Disentangling himself with a warm, tolerant smile and a few words of affection, Ben moved on to Mara's cell and keyed it open. Without Valen and the Inquisitor there to masquerade for, Ben was a little different than Obi-Wan, Luke could see. His posture was more hunched, his movement more cautious, even his accent deeper and rounder, especially on the vowels. Tatooine was easy on no one, and neither was age. That those ravages could transcend the physical, Luke had long known. Not to mention everything that Ben had lost, the depths of which Luke was only just beginning to understand, seeing the temple in all its former, filled, and living glory. But then Luke couldn't think about that anymore, because Ben unlocked Mara's cuffs, and as Luke braced for the joy of her presence rushing back into his mind, Mara collapsed. The Force. A long-bred instinct registered the clang of hard metal on the equally hard floor, but distantly. Nothing in Mara cared. She had the Force. It was light after days in a dark, sealed vault. Sound after weeks drifting in vacuum, the touch of another person after months and years alone. The touch of the whole universe, after she had lost it. Her head was swimming with the sensations. Her perceptions weren't blinded, not at all, the opposite. She perceived too much everything, it felt like. The chill of the air and the mind of her husband and the life forces of thousands of sentients around her, tens of thousands within her grasp. Laughing and mourning and sick with fear and viruses and alcohol and too much joy, going about their normal days, living through days that would change their lives, all at once, all around her. Above her, below her, within her. When Mara's perceptions drifted back into her physical body, the first thing she noticed was the press of her hands on the cold, smooth duracrete of the floor. She'd fallen to her knees. Slowly, she began to perceive with her eyes, not just the Force. Luke was crouching in front of her, hand running. Yes, she could feel it, his hand on her body through the strands of her hair. Luke. Their bond was open again, open to her, the way it had been open to him, the way the rest of the Force had been open to him and had only just returned to her. She flowed along the link and embraced his body at the exact same moment as she embraced his mind. Mara, he whispered, voice filtering down to her as she slowly rose all the way up to regular consciousness. Mara. Losing contact with the Force for short periods, due to inhibitors or those damnable lizards, was always painful, stifling, blinding but bearable. Losing the Force for days. How had she done it, in the aftermath of the Emperor's death, when her ability to touch the Force was more gone than not? How had she done it? Mara knew the answer to that not well. Speech didn't come easy to her. Mara thought that maybe it never would again, but in the same moment she knew that thought was irrational, the product of the sudden and euphoric restoration of the Force. Of course she'd be able to talk. And after wrestling her words to the surface, up her throat and through her teeth, she managed. I'm here, she whispered back. I'm here. Ultimately, Ben had led them into an interrogation room, though he assured them that he had wiped all of the footage from their cells. He had ducked out to interrogate Valen and the Inquisitor, or rather, to keep them from getting even more suspicious and to give Mara some privacy and time to recover. She had made the decision to appreciate it rather than resent that he could tell it was necessary. She was mostly succeeding in following through on that one. But when he'd coming back, when she had seen him go to bring along the Force binders she'd left on the floor where they had fallen, Mara had twitched violently despite all of her efforts to the contrary. So she could reluctantly admit that he wasn't wrong about her having needed the time. It had been the first time she'd had alone with Luke, unobserved, since before they'd been captured. The first time without anything looming between them since they'd started their damn charade. I have 3 goals for tonight, Ben said, and Mara shoved her brain into mission mode, because that was what she did. The first is to briefly discuss some of the logistics of our rather peculiar situation. The second is to sabotage Mara's Force binders irreparably. And the third is to go pretend to interrogate Valen and the Inquisitor some more and give you two some much needed alone time. The thought of that was almost as amazing as being able to touch the Force. The first thing they should know, Ben had told them, was that they were indeed in their own past. The various theories in temporal physics about alternate dimensions spawning from every change, paradoxes forming at the drop of a hat, all irrelevant at best. Time was an illusion. Or maybe it was as fluid as the Force. Luke wasn't terribly clear on that point, and by the end of the conversation had strongly suspected it only made sense if you were part of the Force. But they were in their own past, was the important part. And they had the ability to change their own future. Luke's plans of saving his father, saving the galaxy if they were smart enough and quick enough and probably good enough in a lightsaber fight, those plans could succeed. In a conversation filled with vague but wise-sounding pronouncements that had given Luke incredibly vivid flashes of Tatooine and Dagobah. That was one of few points that Ben had been completely clear on. Another was that they could get home. Ben just didn't know how. He was not, he had explained, omniscient however much he might enjoy talking like it, he had self-deprecatingly joked. He knew there was a way, could feel from the way that the Force wove around Luke and Mara that they weren't permanently anchored in the past. But what form any potential return would take, and what would happen when they emerged on the other side, that, Ben could only guess. He had then left to give Luke and Mara some time together, and that move had probably cemented his place on the top of Luke's list of favorite incarnations of Obi-Wan Kenobi. Not that he was playing favorites. So, Ahsoka's brow marking was raised and her feet were swinging under the table of the interrogation room. Who's your mom, anyway? I'm not telling you that, Luke replied, making sure to keep his expression aloof and his voice level. Ahsoka rolled her eyes. I was just asking to make conversation, she said, expression approaching a pout. Everyone with eyes knows it's Padme. Luke knew just enough about the circumstances of his birth to know that she was right. But Ben had never enjoyed talking about it, the handful of times he'd appeared, and his father's ghost hadn't stuck around after Endor. Whatever you say. Luke sighed internally. He should probably be leaning into his cover, the way he was always supposed to be doing. Ahsoka had certainly been in the room to hear some pretty awful things, back on the ship. But lying to his father and even Ben was one thing. Menacing a 16-year-old that badly was something else entirely. So was leaving a 16-year-old in a room with a Sith. The temple guard stationed outside the door didn't change the fact that whoever had allowed this was being pretty damn negligent. Assuming Anakin and Obi-Wan actually knew she was there. Luke was starting to get the impression that that might not be the case. Ahsoka's legs continued their rhythmic kicking. There's something I was wondering, she said suddenly. Oh? Luke said, voice sharply neutral. Ahsoka didn't seem discouraged by his lack of receptiveness at all. I saw your lightsaber, during the fight. You know, the one where you and your empress or whatever lost and got taken prisoner. But while everyone else was fighting with a red lightsaber, yours wasn't corrupted. Of course it wasn't. Everything inside Luke shuddered at the thought of inflicting that kind of violence on his crystal, of torturing it until it bled. Well, he forced a shrug. I had only fallen 2 days before. Oh, silly me, somehow I thought lightsaber corruption was higher on the dark side priority list. It's up there, but it's still behind mastering maniacal laughter and picking a sufficiently evil-sounding name. Ahsoka snorted, and then quickly sobered. And where, exactly, does torturing and or corrupting Jedi Padawans fall on that list? She had definitely heard about that, then. Luke forced himself to shrug and reply, somewhere in the middle. Ahsoka's face soured, her mouth crinkling in disgust. Skyguy deserves better than you, she muttered. And then she turned and left. Anakin had planned to wait until he had Luke alone. He really had. But the second he saw his son lounging there in his cell, laughing over some undoubtedly cruel joke with the Sith that had tortured him. This is who you're giving your life to? Anakin demanded, gesturing angrily at Vection. You could have been killed for attacking Obi-Wan and trying to escape, but you'd risk your life on the order of the piece of shit who violated your mind and turned your life into a living nightmare? Period. The Inquisitor broke out in malicious laughter. And you Jedi say the dark side is weak. But look what we have wrought. Luke didn't look at the Inquisitor. Instead, he stared straight into Anakin's eyes. The colors matched almost perfectly, and Anakin was just left to be thankful for that. I didn't do it on her orders, Father. So Vection had said before, and Anakin honestly wasn't sure if that was worse. Anything that meant Luke was less beholden to Vection was good, but that he had fallen so far that he'd attack Obi-Wan on his own. Then Luke smirked. I didn't do it on her orders, I did it to impress her. That was definitely worse. Why? Because she deserves it, for showing me the dark. Because she is my master, and I would do anything for her. Vection's smirk looked like she was about to devour someone alive. Her voice, when she spoke, scorched the air. Isn't he beautiful? He couldn't kill her. He couldn't. Not here, in front of witnesses and holocaums. Not when he needed to reach the son she'd brainwashed. The council would almost certainly execute her anyway, once they got the information they needed. It would be fine. She'd never be able to hurt Luke again. He just had to reach Luke before the council brought out their lightsabers. Had to turn him back, had to somehow prove that he had saved his son to a council that didn't even believe it was possible. He'd find a way. He had to. Anakin sneered at Vection. You're pathetic. Vection leaned forward and her eyes gleamed with what, given the Force binders, had to just be the lighting. And yet, she said, I have what you want more than anything, your son. She turned to Luke. Don't I, dear? Luke's expression was reverent. But Anakin hoped to the Force he wasn't imagining that slightest hint of conflict as Luke spoke again. Yes, my master. Enough. Anakin yelled. Luke, you're coming with me. After what Luke had done to Obi-Wan, Anakin was on his highest guard the whole way to the interrogation room. But Luke offered no resistance. Which was good, because Anakin really didn't need the temple guards to insist on being there for the coming conversation. Maybe it meant something that Luke followed him willingly. Or maybe it just meant that Luke had already proven his point. To Vection. Force, Anakin kind of wanted to vomit. Despite all Luke had said and done, Anakin resisted the urge to shove Luke down into the chair. But Anakin couldn't keep the intensity off his face nor, he suspected, the betrayal as he sat down. Why did you do it, Luke? Why did you attack Obi-Wan? I told you, Luke said, voice level. To impress my master. Damn it, Luke, you're lucky Master T and Obi-Wan and the guards didn't kill you. That, finally, got Luke to blink. If it makes you feel better, he said slowly, I timed it that way on purpose. I was pretty sure that Master T would be the least likely to kill me once I surrendered if the attempt failed. What, were you planning to surrender? The Jedi don't kill those who surrender. Luke shrugged. I knew I might fail. Luke sounded way too casual about that. Added to the pretty large tactical flaws in the attack. After all, Luke had struck in a locked interrogation room instead of the hallway, where he'd be closer to the other Sith, and where the guards would be unable to all attack him at once. And with Master T and 2 guards in the room, when Anakin interrogated him alone all the time, when even Obi-Wan did often enough. Anakin inhaled sharply. You weren't trying to succeed. At that, Luke looked uncomfortable. Why would you think that? He asked, in a tone that Anakin knew Obi-Wan would label as hedging. Because everything about the timing and location of the attack was so stupid. I impressed Lord Vection, Luke said quickly. I succeeded in what I want to do. Don't lie to me, Anakin snarled. Then a horrible thought struck him. What did you do to Obi-Wan? I overwhelmed his shields. What did it look like? Luke bit back. That's what impressed my master, proving that I was strong enough in the Force to overwhelm a Jedi Counselor of the Old Republic. If the healers had found any sign of psychic injury, anything besides Obi-Wan inside his head, Anakin never would have believed Luke. But maybe he could. Maybe this meant his son hadn't fallen so far as to actually want to hurt Obi-Wan. How is he? Luke asked, something odd in his face. It was probably naive to hope that it was regret. Why? Hoping to glow to his face. Maybe I'm genuinely concerned. Luke sounded the furthest thing from genuinely concerned. Anakin scoffed. Well, luckily for you, he was released from the healers within a day, or we'd be having a very different conversation. I suppose I'll be grateful for that, then, Luke said, his lips oddly short of a smirk.